The first thing you notice, if you ever stood in the loading yard behind the Ozark Valley Hatchery outside Pruitt's Fork, Arkansas, on a Tuesday morning in early spring, was the smell. Not rotten, exactly, just wet and mineral, like a creek bed after rain. Under a corrugated steel awning sat 3 dumpsters, 40-gallon drums really, each one heaped past the rim with broken eggshells, cracked eggs, unhatched eggs, shells punctured by the candling process, the whole slick, translucent mess of a hatchery's daily failure rate. Every week the hatchery paid a hauling company $40 a load to cart it to the county landfill. Nobody who worked there thought of it as anything but a nuisance that had to be gotten rid of before it drew flies. Della Whitfield first saw those drums the way most people in Carroll County had seen them for years, from her truck window, waiting on a feed delivery, not thinking about them at all. She was 53 that spring, 3 years widowed, and living alone on 11 acres her husband Ray had always meant to do something with and never had. Ray had worked at the hatchery himself, on the incubator line, for 19 years before the heart attack that took him on a Thursday in his own driveway. After he died, Della kept the house and the small vegetable garden she'd always half-tended, and she took a part-time job doing the hatchery's books 3 days a week, mostly because the bank account needed it, and mostly because she didn't know what else to do with her hands. She was not, by her own account, a gardener of any particular skill. Her tomatoes came up leggy. Her squash got blossom end rot most years, a black, leathery patch on the bottom of the fruit that she'd always blamed on bad luck. It wasn't luck, it was calcium. Tomatoes and squash need a steady supply of it to build cell walls as the fruit swells, and without it, the plant cannibalizes its own developing fruit to keep the rest of itself alive, and you get rot. Della didn't know that yet. Nobody had ever told her, and the county extension pamphlets she'd occasionally picked up and never read sat in a kitchen drawer with rubber bands and dead batteries. What she did know, doing the books that spring, was that the hatchery was writing checks for eggshell disposal every single week, rain or shine, $40 a pop, and that the number bothered her in the particular way numbers bother a bookkeeper. It wasn't a lot of money to the hatchery. It was, she thought, a strange amount of money to pay to throw something away. She asked Wendell Cass, the hatchery's manager, what happened to the shells before the trucks came, and he laughed and said they used to just dump them out back until the county made them switch to hauling. "It's garbage, Della," he said. "It's not good for anything. It doesn't even compost right. It just sits there." That should have been the end of it. Instead, on a whim she couldn't fully explain even to herself, she asked if she could take a few buckets home instead of them going in the dumpster. Wendell shrugged and said, "Take all you want. It saves us the tipping fee on volume anyway." She did not know why she wanted them. She told people later it was because Ray had spent 19 years standing over shells like that, and throwing them away felt like throwing away something of his, which wasn't rational, and she knew it wasn't rational, but it got her to load 3 5-gallon buckets into the bed of her truck. Her first instinct was the obvious one: crush them up and toss them straight into the garden, the way her own grandmother used to save shells from the kitchen and scatter them around the base of her hydrangeas. Della spread 2 buckets worth across her raised beds that same week, whole shells and shell fragments both, some pieces the size of a $50. Nothing happened. Not that summer, not the next. A whole eggshell, or even a large fragment of one, takes years to break down in garden soil under natural conditions. The calcium carbonate is locked into a dense crystalline structure, and soil microbes and weak acids can only nibble at the edges of a big piece. She'd essentially buried gravel. Her tomatoes still got blossom end rot that August, and she felt a little foolish about the whole thing, and might have let it drop there if Wendell hadn't kept telling her to come get more, since it was one less truckload for him to pay for. It was her neighbor, an older man named Otis Fiesel, who kept a much better garden than she did, who noticed the shell fragments in her beds one afternoon while borrowing her post-hole digger, and told her, without much ceremony, that whole shells were useless for that purpose. Got to grind it, he said. Fine as you can get it. Powder if you can manage it. That's what makes it work. He didn't explain the chemistry because he didn't know it in those terms, but the folk knowledge was sound. Surface area is what determines how fast a mineral amendment releases into soil. A whole shell has almost none relative to its mass. Ground to a fine powder, that same shell has thousands of times more surface exposed to soil moisture and microbial acids, and can begin releasing usable calcium within weeks instead of years. That sent Della to her kitchen with a rolling pin and a Ziploc bag, which taught her the second lesson the hard way. Crushing dried shells by hand, even with the rolling pin, produced a mix of coarse chips and dust, uneven and slow, and it took her most of an evening to process what amounted to a single dozen eggs worth of shell. At hatchery scale, where she was hauling home 5-gallon buckets, that method was worthless. She needed a grinder, and she didn't have the first idea what kind. She spent $40, the same figure that had first caught her eye in the hatchery's books, which she noted with some irony, on a used hammer mill she found advertised in the Farm and Home Trader, the kind of small mill farmers once used to crack corn for feed. It was rusted, missing a belt guard, and Wendell's son helped her get it running in her pole barn. Her first attempt at grinding a full bucket of raw shells taught her failure number 2. She hadn't dried them first. Fresh shells, straight from the hatchery, still carried a film of albumin, the egg white residue, and moisture from the wash. Run through the mill wet, it gummed up the hammers, clogged the screen, and produced a paste instead of a powder, and stopped the machine dead within about 90 seconds. She spent an afternoon with a screwdriver and a great deal of profanity getting the compacted mess out of the housing. She learned, after that, to spread the shells thin on old window screens set up on sawhorses in the pole barn, letting them air dry for 4 or 5 days depending on humidity, turning them once a day before ever putting them near the mill. Dried shells were brittle and light and shattered clean. Her third failure was more expensive and more instructive. She got greedy with a batch that summer. 2 full truckloads of shells, more than she'd ever processed at once, and instead of laying them out properly, stacked several buckets deep under a tarp in the barn to save space while she caught up on drying the rest. Arkansas summers are humid, and shells packed deep and covered hold moisture and warmth like a compost pile. Within a week, the whole stack had gone slick with mold, a grayish fuzz she didn't recognize until she pulled the tarp back and the smell hit her. Sulfurous, wrong, nothing like the mild, wet mineral smell of fresh shells. She lost the entire batch, close to 150 pounds of raw material, because there was no way to know if pathogens like salmonella, which hatchery byproducts can carry if not handled properly, had taken hold in that damp, warm stack. She wasn't going to sell soil amendment to anybody without being sure of that, so she hauled the whole rotten mess to the county compost site herself and started over, and that loss taught her the rule she never broke again afterward. Shells get spread thin, dried fast, and processed within a week of arriving. No exceptions, no shortcuts for volume. It was around this time, her second year of tinkering, still giving most of her ground shell away to neighbors or working it into her own garden, that she met Earl Tice. Earl had spent 31 years blending fertilizer for a regional supply company over in Berryville before his hands gave out on him, arthritis bad enough that he couldn't manage the augers and scoops anymore, and he'd retired to a small place a few miles from Della with nothing much to do but sit on his porch. Otis Feazell, who knew everybody, brought him by one afternoon because, as Otis put it, Earl knows more about what makes dirt work than the county agent does. Earl was not a talker. He looked at Della's mill, looked at a jar of her ground shell held up to the light, rubbed a pinch of it between his fingers, and said maybe 11 words that first visit. Too coarse still, and you want to know your calcium number. Then he left. It took Della weeks to understand both halves of that sentence. The first was straightforward once Earl, on a later visit, showed her what he meant, running the powder through a series of kitchen sieves and noting that a real amendment needed most of its particles fine enough to pass an 80 to 100 mesh screen. Essentially a powder finer than cornmeal, closer to flour, because particle size determined how fast the calcium became plant available. Her hammer mill, running once through, left too much of the product as coarse grit. She started running everything through twice, and then built a simple sifting box with hardware cloth screens, of decreasing size, to separate the coarse fraction back out and regrind it, instead of selling an inconsistent mix. The second half, knowing her calcium number, took longer and mattered more. Earl explained in his sparing way that eggshell is roughly 94 to 97% calcium carbonate, the same base mineral as agricultural lime, but that buyers, especially anybody buying at any real scale, wouldn't take her word for it. If she wanted to sell this as a real soil product and not a garden curiosity, she needed a lab test confirming the calcium carbonate equivalent, the standard measure used to compare any liming material, so a nursery or grower could actually calculate an application rate instead of guessing. She sent a sample to the University of Arkansas Cooperative Extension Soil Lab that fall for around $20 and got back a number, 93.8% calcium carbonate equivalent, with a fineness rating good enough to call it fast-acting compared to raw agricultural lime, which is often coarser stone dust and releases much more slowly. That single sheet of paper, more than anything else, was what let her stop thinking of herself as somebody who fooled around with eggshells in a barn. Earl's other piece of advice came almost as an aside, months later, while he was helping her adjust the tension on the mill's drive belt. Don't sell dirt, sell a number. At the time, she thought he meant simply that the lab report was her selling point. It wasn't until 2 years afterward, sitting across a table from a nursery buyer who wanted exact percentages and consistency guarantees before he'd sign anything, that she understood the fuller meaning, that in that business, nobody was buying a bag of crushed eggshell out of sentiment or novelty. They were buying a guaranteed, repeatable analysis they could build a fertility program around. The product had to perform the same way, batch after batch, or the relationship was worthless. Her first sale, if you could call it that, came almost by accident in the fall of her second year. Otis Feazell had been raving to the woman who ran the Pruitt's Fork Farmers Market about how his hydrangeas had turned a much deeper color and his tomatoes had stopped rotting on the bottom, ever since Della started dosing his beds with her shell powder. That woman, Margene Odom, asked Della to bring a table to the Saturday market, mostly out of curiosity. Della packed 40 small paper bags of ground shell, a pound apiece, priced at $2 a bag, mostly to cover the cost of the bags themselves. She sold 31 of them and gave the rest away to people who asked questions, and came home with $62 and a stack of names people wanted her to call when she had more. That was enough to make her serious about scale, though not yet serious about business. She kept at the farmer's market through the next year, raising her price to $3 a bag as word spread about the blossom and rot results people were seeing, and started labeling the bags with her lab-tested calcium carbonate equivalent number, at Earl's insistence, right there on the front. People trust a number more than a story, he told her. It was around then that a woman who managed the greenhouse at a garden center in Harrison, 20-some miles off, bought a few bags at market to try in her potting mixes, and came back a month later asking if Della could supply her wholesale in 25-pound sacks on a standing monthly order. That account taught her failure number 4, the costliest so far, though it was a failure of scale rather than of process. She underestimated what a standing monthly order of 25-pound sacks actually meant in terms of raw material. Her old hammer mill, hand-fed a scoop at a time, could process maybe 80 pounds of dried shell an hour on a good day. To fill that one greenhouse account, she needed several hundred pounds a month, which was manageable, barely, until a second and then a third garden center came calling after seeing the product on a shelf in Harrison. She missed a delivery date that first winter. Badly missed it, 3 weeks late, because a cold snap slowed her drying racks to a crawl and she had no way to speed the process. And the garden center manager, not unkindly but firmly, told her that if she couldn't deliver on schedule, she couldn't be their supplier, full stop, because they had their own spring planting rush to plan around and couldn't wait on her. Losing that predictability rattled her more than any of the physical failures had. She and Earl spent a long evening working through what had actually gone wrong, and the answer wasn't more hustle, it was capacity and buffering. She needed to dry shells indoors, independent of weather, and she needed to keep a rolling reserve of finished product on hand rather than grinding to order. She used savings and a small loan from the local bank, co-signed in spirit if not on paper, by Ray's old hatchery pension, to convert one end of the pole barn into a proper drying room with a dehumidifier and box fans running constantly, and to buy a second, larger hammer mill second-hand from a feed mill that was closing down over in Missouri. She also, at Earl's suggestion, started keeping 2 months of finished, bagged product in reserve at all times before taking on any new account, a rule that felt wasteful at first and saved her twice in the years that followed when equipment broke down at the worst possible moment. There was one more real failure in there, a bad batch that nearly cost her the Harrison account permanently rather than temporarily. She'd started sourcing supplemental shell from a second, smaller hatchery 2 counties over, when Ozark Valley's own volume couldn't keep pace with demand, and that hatchery's shells, unbeknownst to her, were coming off a line that also handled duck eggs, whose shells are noticeably harder and denser than chicken shells and grind differently, leaving a coarser, more variable product mixed in with her chicken shell powder. A greenhouse customer noticed grit in the mix and complained that it wasn't dissolving evenly. It was a small thing, technically, but it violated the whole promise. A consistent, tested number, every bag the same. She dropped that second hatchery as a supplier rather than try to sort duck shell from chicken shell on a sorting table, and went back to relying solely on Ozark Valley, working instead with Wendell to make sure they held her volume steady by having the incubator crew set candled and cracked shells aside in a separate bin rather than mixing everything at random. By her 5th year, what had started as 3 5-gallon buckets in a truck bed had become a real operation. She'd registered the business. She called it Whitfield Shell and Soil, and hired a young man from town, Dalton Presley, part-time, to run the second mill and manage the drying room while she handled sales calls and paperwork. The same bookkeeping instincts that had first noticed the $40 hauling charge, now keeping her own accounts straight. Wendell no longer paid a hauling company anything at all for eggshell disposal. Instead, Della paid Ozark Valley a small per-load fee for the raw shell, which flipped what had been a cost on the hatchery's books into a modest but real credit, and turned Wendell from a man doing her a favor into an actual business partner who made sure his crew kept the shells clean and properly separated because he had skin in it now too. The bigger turn came through the garden center in Harrison, whose owner belonged to a regional buying group that supplied nurseries and garden retailers across 3 states. He mentioned Della's product at a trade meeting, mostly in passing, describing it as a fast-acting, locally sourced calcium amendment with a documented 90+% carbonate equivalent, cheaper per unit of calcium than a lot of the mined and processed lime products on the market because her raw material cost her almost nothing. A distributor who supplied garden centers across Arkansas, Missouri, and Oklahoma called her directly that winter, ran his own third-party test on a sample she sent. It came back at 94.1%, close enough to her own lab's number that he trusted the rest of her paperwork, and offered her a contract to supply him in bulk. A full pallet of 40-pound bags at a time, for distribution to nurseries under both her own label and a private label he sold under his own brand. That contract was the thing that actually changed her life in a way she could point to on a calendar. It meant steady, contracted volume instead of chasing individual garden centers one at a time, and it meant she finally justified buying a proper pelletizing attachment for the mill, which let her offer the product in a slow-release granular form, as well as the fine powder, the granules breaking down over a season, rather than immediately, which greenhouse growers doing long-season crops preferred, since it meant fewer repeat applications. Earl, by then in his late 70s and slower than he'd been, still came by most weeks, though it was mostly to sit in a folding chair by the drying room and watch, occasionally correcting Dalton's screen-sifting technique with a single sentence. Earl died the December after that distributor contract was signed, in his sleep, at home, the kind of quiet ending Della thought he probably would have chosen if anybody had asked him. At the small funeral in Pruitt's Fork, Otis Feazell told her that Earl had mentioned her more than once at the feed store in his last year, telling anyone who'd listen that the widow out on the Vance Road had built something real out of garbage because she'd bothered to ask what the number actually was instead of trusting her eyes. Della thought about "don't sell dirt, sell a number" a great deal in the weeks after that, turning it over the way you do with something a person only says once but means for the rest of your life, and she understood then that he hadn't just been telling her how to run a business. He'd been telling her that the whole difference between something being trash and something being valuable was never really in the material at all. A cracked eggshell is a cracked eggshell whether it's in a landfill or a nursery's potting mix. The difference was entirely in whether somebody had bothered to measure it, test it, and stand behind it consistently enough that other people could build on it too. Wendell still runs the incubator line at Ozark Valley Hatchery, older now, still setting the cracked shells aside in their own bin every morning, out of habit as much as contract. The dumpsters and the $40 hauling fee are long gone from the hatchery's books. Whitfield Shell and Soil now processes shell from 2 hatcheries and ships bagged and palletized product to garden centers and nurseries in 3 states, with Dalton Presley managing daily production and a second part-time hire helping with the pelletizer. Della still keeps the books herself, still runs the numbers by hand in the evenings, the way she always did, and still has a jar on her kitchen windowsill with the very first lab report from the University Extension Office taped to the side of it, the number 93.8, written in a chemist's careful hand, the number that turned a widow's odd habit of hauling home other people's garbage into a business that put calcium into greenhouse soil from the Ozarks to the Oklahoma Panhandle, 1 dried, ground, tested pound at a time. 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 1 dried, ground, cundred. There is a particular hour, most mornings now, when Della walks the length of the pole barn before Dalton arrives, checking the drying racks the way Ray used to check his incubators, running a hand along the screens to feel whether the shells have gone brittle enough yet or need another day. She still does this even though Dalton would tell her, correctly, that the humidity gauge on the wall does the same job more precisely than her fingers ever could. She keeps doing it anyway, because some habits outlast their usefulness and earn their keep by other means. The greenhouse manager in Harrison still calls her directly sometimes, skipping the distributor entirely, because she likes hearing Della's voice tell her the fineness rating on that week's batch, and because she remembers being the first customer to ever place a standing order with a woman who was, at the time, still selling paper bags out of a card table at a Saturday market. Margene Odom, who ran that market for 11 more years before handing it off to her daughter, kept a photograph behind the register of Della's original table, the hand-lettered sign, the stack of 1-pound bags, and would show it to anyone who asked how the shell powder in the garden center 40 miles away had gotten its start. Otis Feazell is in his 80s now and still keeps the best garden in the county, and still tells anyone who'll listen that he was the one who told her to grind it fine, though he's generous enough to admit Earl was the one who taught her to prove it. His hydrangeas are, by his own account, bluer than they have any right to be for the soil pH out on his stretch of the Vance Road, and he credits the shell for that too, though Della has told him more than once that's more a matter of aluminum availability than calcium, and he waves her off every time because he likes his version better. Wendell's granddaughter works the incubator line part-time now during her breaks from community college, and she sets the cracked shells aside in their bin without ever having been told why it matters, only that it's the way it's done, which is its own kind of inheritance, even if nobody calls it that. Della never remarried, never much looked to, and says when asked that she already has a second act she didn't see coming, which is more than a lot of people get. She keeps a photograph of Ray on the wall of the little office she built into the front corner of the pole barn, not far from the extension lab report still taped to that jar. And some mornings, going over the delivery schedule before the truck comes for the pallets, she talks to him a little, the way people do, telling him the numbers for the week, the tonnage, the new account in Tulsa that came through on a friend's recommendation. He would have liked knowing, she thinks, that something he spent 19 years standing over, something everyone at that hatchery had always called nothing but a mess to be hauled away, turned out to be worth 94% of something, if only somebody had thought to ask.